Net zero, at its core, is a concept designed to address one of the most pressing challenges of our time, climate change. The term refers to achieving a balance between the amount of greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere and the amount removed from it. In simpler terms, it means that for every ton of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that we release, we must remove an equivalent amount. This can be achieved through natural processes like afforestation, reforestation, and soil restoration, or through technological solutions such as direct air capture and carbon storage systems. On the surface, the idea of net zero is compelling and logical. It offers a framework for reducing the overall impact of human activities on the planet's climate system. However, while the principle itself may seem straightforward and noble, the practical implementation of net zero policies is far more complex and, in some cases, problematic. There is a growing tendency among certain policymakers and activists to treat net zero not as a scientific or technical goal, but as an ideological imperative, something to be achieved at any cost, regardless of the economic, social, or infrastructural consequences. This mindset can lead to policies that are not grounded in realism or pragmatism, but rather in urgency and absolutism. It is important to understand that greenhouse gas emissions are not evenly distributed across sectors or regions. Different countries have different energy systems, economic dependencies, and social structures. For example, a nation heavily reliant on agriculture or manufacturing will face different challenges than a service-based economy. Imposing uniform, net zero targets and timeframes across all regions and industries without accommodating these differences can lead to disruptions, inefficiencies, and social discontent. When governments rush to meet rigid emission targets, they may shut down energy sources, restrict industries, or impose regulations faster than viable alternatives can be developed or scaled. Moreover, the concept of net zero often becomes distorted in political discourse. Rather than encouraging a thoughtful transition, it is sometimes used to justify sweeping reforms that lack empirical support or fail to consider the long-term consequences. For instance, removing fossil fuel infrastructure before renewable energy systems are robust enough to meet demand can result in energy insecurity, blackouts, and inflated costs for consumers. Similarly, banning combustion engine vehicles while electric vehicle infrastructure is still insufficient penalizes the population without offering a realistic substitute. The focus on carbon accounting also tends to overlook the broader ecological and societal context. Not all emissions are equally harmful in their environmental or social impact, and not all solutions are equally beneficial. A narrow obsession with achieving numerical carbon neutrality may ignore other critical environmental factors such as biodiversity, water usage, and soil health. It can also result in policies that prioritize cosmetic carbon offsets over real, long-term reductions in environmental degradation. For example, funding reforestation projects in one part of the world to offset emissions in another may look good on paper, but can involve land grabs, displacement of indigenous communities, or the planting of monoculture forests with limited ecological value. Another issue with how net zero is often approached is the assumption that technological and behavioral changes can occur overnight. Transitioning to a green economy requires innovation, investment, education, and time. It also demands that people be brought along with the process, not pushed aside. When net zero policies are implemented through top-down mandates without public input or consideration for local conditions, they risk alienating the very citizens who are meant to benefit from a cleaner planet. Resistance to environmental measures often stems not from denialism, but from the feeling that policies are being imposed without fairness, foresight, or feasibility. In essence, while the idea of net zero is scientifically grounded and potentially beneficial, the way it is currently being pursued in some circles raises significant concerns. A balanced approach is needed, one that recognizes the value of emission reductions but also respects the diversity of economic systems, the importance of energy security, and the complexity of social change. Net zero should be a destination, not a dogma. It should inspire innovation, not impose hardship. And most importantly, it should be treated as a shared journey, one that all sectors of society can contribute to and benefit from, rather than a rigid metric enforced without regard for its wider implications. Understanding net zero means understanding its potential and its pitfalls. When framed correctly, it can be a guiding star for sustainability. When applied thoughtlessly, it risks becoming a source of division and disruption. Therefore, any discussion about climate policy must begin not with slogans or ultimatums, but with education, inclusion, and careful planning. One of the most immediate and visible consequences of aggressive net zero policies is the economic burden that they place on working citizens, particularly those who are already vulnerable due to limited income, geographic isolation, or dependence on traditional energy and industrial sectors. While the long-term goals of achieving environmental sustainability are important, the pathway chosen to reach these goals often overlooks the realities faced by the everyday worker, family, or small business owner. At the heart of this issue lies the sharp increase in energy costs. As governments phase out fossil fuels and restrict traditional forms of energy production, such as coal, natural gas, and oil, the supply of cheap and reliable energy contracts. At the same time, renewable energy infrastructure is still under development in many regions and cannot yet deliver the same level of consistency, affordability, or scale. This supply gap often leads to higher utility bills for households and rising operational costs for businesses. While wealthier individuals or corporations may absorb or offset these expenses, ordinary citizens, especially those in lower income brackets, find themselves struggling to keep up with everyday necessities such as heating, transportation, and food, all of which are energy dependent. Transportation policies offer another clear example of the unintended economic strain placed on working people. In many countries, internal combustion engine vehicles are being phased out, restricted, or taxed at increasingly punitive levels. The intention is to transition to electric vehicles EVs, which produce no tailpipe emissions. However, EV remain prohibitively expensive for many consumers, even with subsidies. Moreover, the supporting infrastructure, charging stations, grid capacity, maintenance knowledge is still unevenly distributed, especially in rural or underserved areas. For someone commuting long distances daily or living in an area without access to efficient public transportation, the sudden push away from gasoline-powered vehicles is not a pathway to sustainability. It is a roadblock to economic survival. Small businesses are also disproportionately affected. Green compliance costs from carbon reporting requirements to energy audits and equipment upgrades can overwhelm businesses operating on thin margins. While large corporations may have entire departments dedicated to sustainability, small enterprises often lack the resources to navigate regulatory complexity or invest in expensive technology upgrades. This creates an uneven playing field where smaller players are squeezed out or forced to cut jobs, reduce services, or shut down altogether. The ripple effect is significant: job losses, local economic decline, and reduced consumer choice. Job displacement is perhaps the most emotionally and socially charged aspect of the transition to net zero. Workers in traditional energy sectors, coal miners, oil rig operators, truck drivers, refinery technicians, are increasingly being told that their industries have no future. Yet they are rarely offered realistic or immediate alternatives. Just transition programs are often underfunded, poorly implemented, or misaligned with the actual needs of the displaced workforce. Retraining coal workers to become coders or solar panel installers sounds visionary on paper, but often fails in practice due to differences in skills, age, location, and opportunity. In the meantime, entire communities that once thrived on energy sector jobs fall into economic stagnation. The irony is that many of these communities are not opposed to environmental progress. They simply want to be part of it, not casualties of it. Unfortunately, current net zero policies are frequently crafted and implemented by centralized institutions, far removed from the realities of those most affected. This creates a democratic deficit in environmental policymaking, where the voices of working people are overshadowed by elite narratives and ideological ambition. There is also a psychological burden to consider. Constant messaging about climate emergencies, guilt over lifestyle choices, and pressure to adopt expensive green alternatives can cause stress, anxiety, and confusion. When people feel they are being blamed for global problems without being offered feasible ways to help, trust in environmental initiatives erodes, climate fatigue sets in. Resistance grows, not because people reject science, but because they resent being unfairly burdened by policies that do not reflect their lived experience. In short, while the aim of reducing emissions is widely accepted as necessary, the current approach to achieving net zero places disproportionate costs on those who can least afford it. It penalizes working citizens without giving them tools to adapt. A truly effective environmental strategy must account for affordability, accessibility, and inclusion. It must avoid making sustainability a luxury for the few and a hardship for the many. If climate policy is to succeed, it must align not only with environmental science but with economic fairness and social cohesion. Working citizens must not be seen as obstacles to progress, but as essential partners in shaping a future that is both green and just. As climate policy continues to take center stage in global and national discussions, one of the emerging concerns is not the objective of reducing emissions, but the manner in which it is pursued. There is a growing pattern in which environmental policy is implemented not through reasoned debate, flexibility, or empirical evidence, but through a form of policy extremism that often ignores economic, social, and technological realities. When climate goals are enforced with ideological rigidity rather than scientific and pragmatic planning, the consequences can be far more damaging than helpful, disrupting infrastructure, harming citizens, and weakening societal trust in environmental reform altogether. Policy extremism, in this context, refers to an approach where climate goals are treated as moral absolutes rather than strategic objectives. This kind of thinking leaves no room for nuance, adaptation, or compromise. The argument is often framed as a binary: immediate action or planetary catastrophe, total transformation or total collapse. Such framing is powerful in political rhetoric, but it can lead to poorly conceived decisions when translated into policy. Governments, under pressure to meet ambitious targets or appeal to activist constituencies, may impose sudden bans, restrictive regulations, or sweeping reforms without ensuring that the necessary infrastructure, technology, or public support is in place. For example, a policy mandating the rapid phase-out of internal combustion vehicles within a few short years may sound impressive from a carbon accounting standpoint, but what happens when the electric grid is not prepared to handle the load from millions of new EV? What happens when battery supply chains are fragile, or when people in remote areas have no access to charging stations? These are not theoretical concerns. They are practical barriers that must be addressed before such policies are implemented. Without planning for these realities, well-meaning laws become sources of frustration, inequality, and inefficiency. Another manifestation of policy extremism is the forced decommissioning of fossil fuel infrastructure before renewable alternatives are operational. It is one thing to promote solar, wind, or hydroelectric power. It is another to dismantle working power plants or ban natural gas heating before sustainable systems can reliably take their place. When this happens, the energy grid becomes vulnerable to instability, blackouts, and price spikes. And once again, the burden falls on average people, not those designing the policies from behind desks in government buildings or academic institutions. Energy security is not a luxury. It is the backbone of any modern society. Compromising it in the name of rapid transition without a viable replacement is not brave, it is reckless. Perhaps most troubling of all is the effect this rigidity has on democratic governance and public trust. When environmental policy becomes ideologically extreme, it tends to exclude dissenting voices, even when those voices are constructive. Experts who question the timeline, the methods, or the unintended consequences of proposed measures are often dismissed as anti-environmental, or worse, as climate deniers. Citizens who protest policies they cannot afford are labeled as ignorant or selfish. This kind of polarization stifles open dialogue, reduces innovation, and creates a climate of fear and conformity. In the end, extremism undermines the very progress it seeks to accelerate. Real progress, by contrast, is based on problem solving, not moralizing. It recognizes that reducing emissions is not just a scientific challenge, but a systems challenge, one that involves energy, economics, logistics, human behavior, and cultural values. Effective climate policy must be adaptive, not dogmatic. It must take into account regional differences, historical dependencies, and existing technological limitations. It must offer incentives as well as regulations, build public confidence as well as technical solutions, and accept that sustainability is a long-term journey, not a political stunt. What makes policy extremism particularly dangerous is that it often backfires. If people feel that environmental measures are unfair, rushed, or disconnected from reality, they may begin to reject the entire premise of climate action. Once disillusionment sets in, the road back to public engagement becomes much harder. Environmental goals cannot succeed without widespread cooperation. That cooperation, in turn, cannot be commanded. It must be earned through transparency, accountability, and respect for differing perspectives. In summary, while the urgency of addressing climate change is real and justified, the path toward meaningful progress must be guided by prudence, not panic. When environmental policy is driven by extremism rather than strategy, it risks causing more harm than the problem it seeks to solve. A sustainable future must be built on thoughtful, inclusive, and science-based action, not on slogans, ultimatums, or ideology masquerading as inevitability. The key to success lies not in forcing change, but in designing systems that allow change to grow naturally, sustainably, and cooperatively. One of the most overlooked aspects in current net zero strategies is the neglect of viable technological alternatives that could provide more balanced, efficient, and inclusive solutions to environmental challenges. While the public narrative often fixates on solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles, a wide array of other technologies, many of them proven, scalable, and clean, are either underutilized or actively dismissed. This selective focus is not due to a lack of scientific merit, but rather because some technologies do not align neatly with the dominant ideological or political narratives shaping climate policy today. Take, for instance, nuclear energy. This technology has been around for decades and is capable of generating massive amounts of electricity with virtually zero carbon emissions. Unlike solar and wind, which are intermittent and depend on weather conditions, nuclear power provides consistent, stable, and large-scale energy output. Despite this, many governments and activist groups oppose its use, citing concerns about safety, waste management, and past accidents. While these concerns are not unfounded, they are often exaggerated or misrepresented, especially in contrast to the real and present limitations of renewables. Modern nuclear reactor designs, such as small modular reactors SMRs, offer safer and more adaptable options, yet they are rarely included in major green transition plans. Another neglected avenue is carbon capture and storage CCS. This technology allows us to capture carbon dioxide emissions directly from industrial sources or even from the ambient air and store them underground in geological formations. It represents a practical way to reduce emissions without dismantling entire industrial processes or shutting down power plants. Yet, despite its potential, CCS has received lukewarm support and limited funding. Critics argue that it allows polluters to continue emitting, but this misses the point. CCS is not a license to pollute. It is a tool to reduce the unavoidable emissions that still come from critical infrastructure and sectors like cement, steel, and aviation. Similarly, synthetic fuels and biofuels can provide cleaner energy for transport without requiring a complete overhaul of existing vehicle fleets and fueling infrastructure. These fuels can be engineered to emit less carbon and can be used in current internal combustion engines, making them an ideal transitional solution. Yet they are often sidelined in favor of pushing for widespread electrification, even when EV technology is not accessible or practical for all populations or geographies. The neglect of these alternatives is not merely a technical oversight. It reflects a deeper issue in the way environmental policy is being shaped. Instead of exploring a broad and inclusive range of solutions, some decision makers and institutions have chosen to back only a narrow set of technologies. This is not inherently a scientific decision, but often a political or ideological one. When certain technologies are embraced not because they are the best, but because they are the most fashionable or politically acceptable, progress becomes limited and inefficient. This selective approach also carries significant risks. By putting too much reliance on a limited set of technologies, we make the entire system more vulnerable to failure. For example, overdependence on wind and solar energy without adequate storage or backup systems can lead to blackouts during periods of low generation. Similarly, relying exclusively on electric vehicles while ignoring improvements in fuel efficiency or synthetic fuels leaves entire sectors, such as long-haul trucking and aviation, without viable near-term options. True resilience in energy and emissions strategy requires a diverse portfolio of technologies, tailored to the specific needs and conditions of different regions and sectors. Moreover, this narrow focus discourages innovation. Startups and researchers working on breakthrough technologies often struggle to gain funding or regulatory approval if their work does not align with the dominant policy framework. This creates a feedback loop where only certain ideas get traction, not because they are the most effective, but because they are the most politically convenient. In the long term, this stifles scientific progress and reduces our collective ability to tackle climate challenges with creativity and flexibility. In conclusion, technological neutrality should be a core principle of any sound environmental strategy. The goal should be to reduce emissions and protect the planet, not to promote one type of solution over another for ideological reasons. Every technology has trade-offs, but dismissing effective tools because they are not fashionable or politically favored does a disservice to the planet and the people. We must be willing to consider all viable paths, whether they are nuclear, synthetic, captured, or engineered. Only through openness to all scientific possibilities can we build a sustainable future that is both realistic and inclusive. One of the most concerning developments in today's environmental policymaking is the increasing lack of democratic consultation and public engagement when implementing large-scale net zero strategies. Rather than fostering open debate and encouraging inclusive participation, many governments have adopted a top-down approach, designing and enforcing climate regulations without sufficiently consulting the very people who are most affected by them. This disconnect between leadership and the public can lead to resentment, resistance, and ultimately, policy failure. In any functioning democracy, public consultation is a cornerstone of legitimate governance. When major societal changes are being proposed, especially those involving energy use, transportation, housing, and industry, citizens deserve a seat at the table. Yet with net zero policies, many decisions are made behind closed doors or in elite policymaking circles where academic, political, or activist ideologies dominate. These groups may be well-intentioned, but they do not always understand the lived realities of farmers, factory workers, truck drivers, or small business owners. Policies that look ideal on paper may prove completely impractical, or even harmful, when applied to the real world. For example, the push to limit car usage in urban centers through congestion charges, fuel taxes, or outright bans on older vehicles often excludes consultation with working class commuters who rely on their cars for their livelihoods. If there are no reliable public transport alternatives available, these individuals are effectively punished for circumstances beyond their control. When such policies are introduced without adequate dialogue or support systems, they are not seen as protective environmental measures. They are experienced as attacks on personal freedom and economic stability. This sense of exclusion is exacerbated when people feel that their dissenting views are ignored or dismissed. Citizens who question the cost, speed, or practicality of net zero policies are frequently labeled as anti-environmental or reactionary, even when their concerns are grounded in everyday experience. This is a dangerous dynamic. When governments shut down discussion or treat legitimate concerns as moral failings, they alienate the very people whose cooperation is essential for success. Real progress in environmental reform requires consent, not coercion. Another problem arises from the centralized nature of policy implementation. Many climate regulations are imposed uniformly across entire nations without accounting for regional differences in geography, industry, and infrastructure. Rural communities, for example, often face the same restrictions as urban areas, even though their energy needs, transport options, and economic structures are entirely different. Such blanket policies create resentment and feed a perception that climate initiatives are designed by and for urban elites, rather than by inclusive consensus. Even worse, climate-related decisions are sometimes made at the international level by unelected bodies, treaty organizations, or advisory councils with limited transparency. These groups may set targets and frameworks that national governments then feel obliged to enforce, sometimes bypassing domestic legislative scrutiny altogether. When people perceive that policy is being dictated from above or from abroad without proper debate or local adaptation, trust in institutions weakens. Citizens may come to view environmental action not as a collective good, but as a foreign imposition or elite agenda. This lack of democratic accountability also extends to the cost of net zero transitions. Many of the financial burdens, rising utility bills, vehicle replacement costs, energy retrofits, fall directly on ordinary households. But how often are those households given a real voice in shaping how these transitions occur or how they are funded? Rarely. Public forums, impact assessments, and citizen assemblies are often symbolic at best or absent altogether. Policies are presented as settled facts, not as proposals to be discussed. This approach breeds frustration and fuels the kind of public backlash that has already appeared in protests across Europe and beyond. The irony is that public participation could significantly improve climate policy outcomes. People are more likely to support change when they understand the reasoning behind it, when they are given time to prepare, and when they feel that their perspectives are valued. Involving communities in decision-making can lead to more creative solutions, greater compliance, and stronger social cohesion. Conversely, when people feel ignored or coerced, even the best intended policies can be rejected outright. To address climate change effectively, we must uphold the democratic principles that protect individual rights and ensure collective legitimacy. Environmental goals cannot be pursued at the expense of public dialogue, transparency, and fairness. If we fail to bring people into the process, as listening to their concerns, adjusting policies to real conditions, and respecting local knowledge, we risk not only derailing climate action, but also damaging the democratic fabric that holds society together. In sum, democratic consultation is not a barrier to net zero. It is a necessity. Real sustainability is not only about lowering emissions, it is about building resilient, inclusive societies where environmental progress is achieved through shared responsibility and mutual respect. In examining the current trajectory of net zero policies, one of the most critical and often underestimated issues is their economic cost and the disproportionate burden they place on low and middle income households. While the overarching goal of reducing emissions and creating a more sustainable future is universally desirable, the path toward that goal has increasingly favored policies that impose significant financial strain on ordinary citizens, while wealthier individuals and corporations often remain shielded from the immediate consequences. Net zero strategies frequently involve sweeping changes in how people use energy, transportation, and household goods. These transitions are not cost neutral. For example, homeowners are being encouraged, or in some cases required, to replace traditional gas boilers with electric heat pumps. While this might reduce emissions in theory, the installation and operating costs of such systems are high, often running into the thousands of pounds or dollars. Even with government subsidies, many working families find these upgrades unaffordable. The same challenge arises with electric vehicles. EV typically come with a high upfront cost, and while some enjoy lower running costs, not every household can afford to make the switch, especially when the second-hand EV market remains limited, and the infrastructure for charging is not yet fully developed in many regions. This financial divide creates a system where green choices become a luxury, accessible mainly to those who already have the resources to invest in new technologies, retrofits, and lifestyle changes. Meanwhile, people with modest incomes are left behind, continuing to use older, less efficient, or now regulated technologies, not because they are unwilling to help the environment, but because they simply cannot afford the alternatives being pushed on them. As a result, these households may face penalties, rising costs, or reduced access to vital services. For them, environmental policy begins to feel less like a collective effort and more like economic punishment. In many regions, this issue is further compounded by rising energy prices, driven in part by the rapid decommissioning of fossil fuel infrastructure. As governments move away from coal, oil, and gas in favor of renewable energy, often without adequate backup systems or storage capacity, energy markets become more volatile, supply becomes less stable, and prices can spike during periods of high demand or low renewable output. Once again, the cost is disproportionately borne by low-income families who already spend a larger share of their earnings on electricity and heating. It's also important to consider that many of the industries most affected by net zero policies, such as agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and transport, are major sources of employment for working-class communities. When environmental regulations raise operating costs or restrict activity in these sectors, companies may downsize, close, or pass on costs to consumers. The result is a double hit: job insecurity on one hand, and increased prices for food, goods, and services on the other. What is particularly troubling is that many of these economic pressures are avoidable. Sensible environmental policy does not have to hurt the poor. In fact, it can be designed to uplift vulnerable communities by offering targeted support, investing in local infrastructure, and ensuring that sustainable alternatives are genuinely affordable and accessible. However, this requires careful planning, inclusive consultation, and a willingness to prioritize social equity alongside environmental goals, something that is often missing in current top-down, target-driven approaches. Even when subsidies and rebates are offered, they are frequently structured in ways that favor the middle and upper classes. Tax credits for EV, for instance, often benefit those with the means to purchase a new vehicle in the first place. Low-income families, many of whom rely on older cars, public transit, or carpooling, see little benefit from such programs. Similarly, grants for home insulation or renewable energy installations often require upfront payments or bureaucratic applications that many people cannot manage easily. If net zero is to succeed in both environmental and social terms, fairness must be placed at the center of the strategy. Climate action should not become a vehicle for widening economic inequality. Instead, it should serve as an opportunity to create a more just and resilient society. This means designing policies that account for the financial realities of ordinary people, ensuring that environmental benefits are distributed broadly, and that no one is left behind in the transition. In summary, while the science behind climate action is clear, the economic implementation of net zero goals must be grounded in justice, balance, and realism. Ignoring the financial strain placed on lower-income households not only risks social backlash, it jeopardizes the entire environmental mission. Equity must be a guiding principle if we are to build both a greener and a fairer future.